Tonight, we begin with a number that defies comprehension. 95,000 Russian soldiers killed or wounded in a single 30-day period fighting for control of one Ukrainian city. Not 95,000 over the course of the entire war, not 95,000 across all fronts. 95,000 casualties in 30 days in Bakhmut, a city that had a pre-war population of 73,000 people, a city so thoroughly destroyed by Russian bombardment that it no longer exists in any meaningful sense, a city that military strategists describe as having negligible strategic value, even if Russia manages to capture it. Between October 15th and November 14th, 2024, Russian forces suffered what British military intelligence is calling the highest casualty rate inflicted on any military force in a single theater since the Second Battle of Fallujah in 2004. Think about that. Russia is losing more soldiers in 1 month fighting for one city than the United States lost in 2 decades of war in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. Here's the first hook. This isn't happening because Ukrainian forces have overwhelming firepower, superiority, or numerical advantage. This is happening because Russian commanders are ordering wave after wave of infantry assaults across open ground against fortified Ukrainian positions, using tactics that military historians thought had been abandoned as obsolete after the First World War. Russian soldiers are dying in attacks that military doctrine abandoned a century ago because those attacks didn't work then, and they don't work now. The extraordinary scale of this slaughter, the sheer mathematical impossibility of sustaining these casualty rates for any extended period, reveals something haunting about how thoroughly Russian military leadership has collapsed into desperation, delusion, or both. Satellite imagery from Maxar Technologies captured on November 10th shows the landscape around Bakhmut transformed into something that looks more like photographs from Verdun in 1916 than anything from 21st century warfare. The ground is cratered by artillery fire, trees are reduced to blackened stumps, buildings are rubble, and scattered across this devastated terrain are what imagery analysts describe as extensive evidence of mass casualties, a euphemistic phrase that means you can see bodies from space. Ukrainian drone footage released by the 93rd Mechanized Brigade shows Russian infantry advancing in densely packed formations across fields with no cover, being cut down by Ukrainian artillery and machine gun fire, falling by the dozens, by the hundreds, while the survivors continue forward until they too are hit. The footage is difficult to watch. The tactics are impossible to understand. This is not a story about tactical setbacks or operational challenges that competent military planning can overcome. This is a story about systematic, industrial-scale destruction of Russia's army by Russia's own commanders, who keep sending soldiers into attacks that everyone from the privates being ordered forward to the Ukrainian defenders killing them to the military analysts worldwide. Watching it happen understands cannot succeed. Now, if you're watching this thinking this is just another update about combat operations in a distant war, about casualty figures that are tragic but don't affect you directly, I need you to understand something fundamental before we go any further. What's happening in Bakhmut isn't just changing the trajectory of the Russia-Ukraine war. What we're witnessing is the complete exposure of Russian military incompetence at a scale that transforms Russia's status as a military power, that eliminates any remaining illusions about Russian military effectiveness, and that raises profound questions about how Russia can continue this war when it's destroying its army faster than it can replace losses. 95,000 casualties in 30 days isn't a sustainable attrition rate. It's organizational suicide by military force. And yet here's what makes this moment so extraordinary in its cruelty. Russian commanders continue ordering these attacks even as the casualty figures mount, even as units are decimated and reformed and decimated again, even as intercepted communications reveal Russian soldiers begging their officers to stop sending them forward. The gap between what Russian military leadership claims is happening systematic progress toward victory and what's actually visible on the ground, systematic destruction of Russia's army, has never been more visible, never been more horrifying in its human cost. And tonight, we're going to examine exactly how this catastrophe unfolded, what it means for Russia's ability to sustain military operations, and why Russian commanders continue tactics that amount to feeding their soldiers into a meat grinder that everyone can see, but no one in Russian leadership seems willing to stop. To understand how Russia ended up suffering 95,000 casualties in 30 days, fighting for a city of negligible strategic importance, we need to understand both the history of the battle for Bakhmut and the broader context of how Russian military doctrine has completely failed in this war. The battle for Bakhmut began in August 2022. That's over 2 years of continuous fighting for control of this single city. The longest battle of World War I, the Battle of Verdun, lasted 10 months and resulted in approximately 700,000 casualties on both sides. Bakhmut has now exceeded Verdun in duration and is approaching it in total casualties when you count both Russian and Ukrainian losses across the entire battle. The city itself has been reduced to ruins. Literally every significant building has been damaged or destroyed. The pre-war population of 73,000 civilians has been reduced to fewer than 2,000 people, mostly elderly residents who refuse to evacuate. There is no functioning infrastructure. No water, no electricity, no civilian economy. The city that Russia is fighting to capture no longer exists in any meaningful sense. Here's the second hook. Despite this complete destruction, despite the astronomical casualties, despite the acknowledged lack of strategic value, Russian military and political leadership have invested Bakhmut with symbolic importance that has transformed it from a tactical objective into what military analysts call a prestige target, a location that must be captured, not because taking it serves any military purpose, but because admitting you can't take it after committing so many resources represents an unacceptable loss of face. Putin personally referenced Bakhmut in speeches 17 times between August 2022 and October 2024, describing its capture as crucial to Russian victory. Russian state media has portrayed Bakhmut as the key to controlling the Donbass region. Russian military bloggers with Kremlin connections have framed Bakhmut as a test of Russian martial spirit and determination. Think about what that means for soldiers on the ground. You're a Russian conscript who's been given minimal training, sent to fight in a war you didn't choose. And now you're being ordered to assault Ukrainian positions because your political leadership has decided that capturing the ruins of a destroyed city matters more than your life. The tactical situation is hopeless. Ukrainian forces hold fortified positions with clear fields of fire. They have artillery superiority in this sector. They have better intelligence and coordination. Your commanders know this, the Ukrainian defenders know this, you know this. And yet the order comes. Advance across open ground toward Ukrainian machine guns because Bakhmut must be taken regardless of cost. The scale of casualties began accelerating dramatically in October 2024 when Russian commanders decided to attempt what military analysts are calling human wave. Assaults the tactic of sending large numbers of infantry forward in concentrated groups, hoping that sheer numbers will overwhelm defenders. These tactics were used extensively in World War I and proved catastrophically ineffective. They were briefly attempted in the early stages of World War II and quickly abandoned because the casualty rates were unsustainable. Russian forces are using them in 2024. The results are predictable. Ukrainian defenders with modern weapons artillery, anti-tank missiles, machine guns, drones engage these massed formations and inflict casualties that are as systematic as they are horrifying. On October 22, 2024, the Ukrainian 93rd Mechanized Brigade released footage showing a single Russian assault involving approximately 800 infantry advancing across a kilometer of open ground toward Ukrainian positions south of Bakhmut. Ukrainian artillery began engaging the formation at 1,200 meters. By the time the assault reached 400 meters from Ukrainian lines close enough for small arms fire, Ukrainian commanders estimated at least 480 Russian soldiers were casualties. The assault continued. Another wave of Russian infantry was committed. More casualties. The attack continued for 4 hours and 40 minutes before Russian forces withdrew. Ukrainian estimates 720 Russian casualties for 0 Ukrainian losses and 0 gain of territory. One assault. 720 casualties. No objective achieved. And yet, the assaults continued. October 23rd, another major Russian attack estimated 650 casualties. October 24th, 890 casualties. October 26th, 1,100 casualties in a single day of assaults. The numbers are so large, so consistent, so appalling that Western military analysts initially questioned their accuracy, assuming Ukrainian forces must be exaggerating or counting wounded multiple times. Then satellite imagery confirmed the scale. Then intercepted Russian communications provided independent casualty figures that matched Ukrainian estimates. Then Russian military bloggers, ostensibly supportive of Russia's war effort, began posting about unacceptable losses and command failures. The numbers were real. The catastrophe was undeniable. Now, let's examine the human dimension of this slaughter. Because beyond the statistics and tactical analysis, are Russian soldiers experiencing a nightmare that their government created and can't seem to stop. Intercepted communications between Russian soldiers in the Bakhmut sector, obtained by Ukrainian signals intelligence and shared with Western partners, paint a picture of a military force experiencing something approaching psychological collapse. In one recording from October 28th, a Russian soldier speaking to his wife says, "They keep sending us forward. We keep dying. Yesterday, my unit had 43 men. Today, we have 19. Tomorrow, they're bringing replacements and sending us again. I don't think I'm coming home," the wife asks if he can refuse. Orders. His response, "They shoot people who refuse. Better to die in the assault than be executed by your own side." That's not military discipline. That's terrorism against your own forces. Think about what that reveals about the Russian military's internal state. Soldiers understand the attacks are suicidal. They understand their commanders are ordering them to die for no tactical gain. And they also understand that refusing means execution. The only choice is which death to accept, the likely one from Ukrainian fire or the certain one from Russian enforcers. This is not how functional militaries operate. This is not how wars are won. This is how armies are destroyed from within. Here's the third hook. The casualties aren't just affecting combat effectiveness, they're creating a demographic catastrophe for entire regions of Russia. According to analysis by independent Russian media outlet Mediazona, which has been documenting Russian military deaths through obituaries, social media posts, and cemetery records, the casualties in Bakhmut are disproportionately drawn from Russia's poorest regions: Dagestan, Buryatia, Tuva, rural areas of Siberia. These regions were already experiencing population decline before the war. The concentration of casualties from these areas represents the permanent loss of an entire generation of young men from communities that cannot absorb those losses. Villages that sent 50 men to fight are getting back 10. The social fabric of these communities is being shredded. In the Russian Republic of Buryatia, local journalists have documented 23 villages where over 20% of military-age men have been killed in Ukraine. 23 villages. 20%. Think about that. 1 in 5 military-age men from these communities are dead, and the war continues, and Russian commanders keep ordering more assaults, and more casualties accumulate. The resilience of these communities, their ability to maintain social cohesion and economic function as their young men disappear, cannot survive this indefinitely. Something will break. On November 2nd, a group of approximately 40 military wives from Buryatia attempted to deliver a petition to regional government offices in Ulan-Ude demanding the withdrawal of Buryat units from Bakhmut. They were met by riot police, 17 were arrested, the protest was dispersed, Russian state media didn't mention it, the war continued. But the fact that these protests are happening, that military families are risking arrest to demand an end to tactics that are killing their husbands and sons, indicates that even in Russia's most politically passive regions, the human cost of Bakhmut is becoming unsustainable for civilian populations. And yet, as these families grieve and protest and desperate soldiers call home, describing the horror they're experiencing, Russian state media continues portraying Bakhmut as a glorious victory in progress. Television broadcasts show carefully edited footage of Russian soldiers in apparently good spirits. Talk show hosts discuss the liberation of Bakhmut as though it were proceeding smoothly. Military analysts on state channels describe Russian tactics as effective and measured. The disconnect between this propaganda and the reality that families are experiencing between the claims of victory and the arrival of coffins has never been wider, never been more hollow in its cruelty. Let's examine the psychological dimension of what's happening to Russian military leadership right now, because the decision to continue tactics that are producing 95,000 casualties in 30 days requires understanding how command structures break down under the pressure of failure. Russian military doctrine, inherited from Soviet practice and adapted for modern warfare, emphasizes centralized control, rigid hierarchies, and the execution of orders regardless of circumstances on the ground. Junior officers have limited authority to adapt tactics based on conditions. Senior commanders issue operational plans and expect them to be implemented exactly as ordered. This system can work when plans are sound and conditions match assumptions. It fails catastrophically when reality diverges from planning, but the command structure can't adapt because adaptation requires acknowledging that the original plan was wrong. Here's the fourth hook. Russian commanders in the Bakhmut sector appear to be trapped in a cycle where continuing failed tactics is psychologically easier than admitting those tactics don't work, because admission would require taking responsibility for the thousands of soldiers already killed using those same methods. They're experiencing what psychologists call escalation of commitment, the tendency to invest more resources into a failing course of action because you've already invested so much that changing course feels like admitting the initial investment was wasted. Every soldier killed in a failed assault makes it harder to admit the assault should stop, because stopping means all those previous deaths were pointless. Think about what this means from a commander's perspective. You ordered an assault that killed 500 of your soldiers and gained nothing. The next day, you face a choice: admit yesterday's assault was a mistake, or order another assault and hope this one succeeds enough to justify yesterday's losses. Admitting the mistake means accepting responsibility for 500 unnecessary deaths. Ordering another assault postpones that reckoning, so you order another assault. It fails. Now you're responsible for 1,000 deaths unless the next assault succeeds. The logic becomes self-reinforcing. The only way to justify past casualties is to continue tactics that create more casualties in hopes that eventual success will retrospectively justify all the losses. The cycle cannot be broken from within. According to leaked briefings from Russian military intelligence reported by investigative outlet The Insider, senior Russian commanders in the Bakhmut sector held a crisis meeting on October 31st to discuss casualty rates. The meeting reportedly lasted 6 hours. Multiple commanders argued that current tactics were unsustainable and should be abandoned in favor of a defensive posture that would preserve forces. The senior-most commander present reportedly responded that President Putin had personally emphasized Bakhmut's importance and that withdrawal or defensive posture would be interpreted as defeatism. The order was given to continue offensive operations. Casualties must be accepted as the cost of victory. The meeting ended. The assaults continued. The soldiers kept dying. And yet, even as this command dysfunction produces casualties at rates that exceed anything seen in modern warfare, Putin continues speaking publicly as though Russian forces are performing effectively and victory is inevitable. On November 8th, Putin gave a televised address describing Russian military operations as proceeding strictly according to plan, with all objectives being methodically achieved. The cognitive dissonance required to make that statement, while 95,000 Russian soldiers become casualties in a single month, suggests either that Putin is being systematically misled by subordinates who are too afraid to report failures, or that Putin himself cannot psychologically accept that the military he rebuilt over 2 decades is being destroyed by its own incompetence. The historical parallels are haunting. Napoleon's marshals continued ordering costly frontal assaults during the retreat from Moscow, even as their army disintegrated, because admitting that the campaign had failed meant accepting blame for catastrophic losses. Hitler's generals continued offensive operations in late 1944, even as Germany's strategic position became hopeless, because the alternative was acknowledging that the war was already lost. Putin's commanders continue human wave assaults at Bakhmut, even as casualty figures reach levels that no military can sustain, because stopping requires admitting that 2 years of fighting and tens of thousands of deaths achieved nothing of value. The pattern repeats because authoritarian command structures create incentives for denial rather than adaptation. Now, let's zoom out and examine what 95,000 casualties in 30 days means for Russia's broader military capability, because losses on this scale don't just affect the battle for Bakhmut, they affect Russia's ability to conduct military operations anywhere. Russia began its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 with approximately 900,000 total active-duty military personnel across all branches. That number included troops committed to other regions, forces in Syria, peacekeepers in various former Soviet republics, units defending Russia's extensive borders, air force and naval personnel who don't serve in ground combat roles. Estimates vary, but most Western intelligence assessments suggest Russia committed approximately 350,000 to 400,000 ground forces to the Ukraine campaign in the first year of the war. Casualties through the end of 2023 were estimated at around 315,000, killed and wounded combined, devastating but potentially sustainable through mobilization and recruitment. The October-November 2024 period in Bakhmut represents an acceleration that changes the strategic calculus entirely. 95,000 casualties in 30 days equals 3,166 casualties per day. If Russia sustains that rate, and reporting from other sectors suggests Bakhmut is the worst, but not the only place experiencing high casualties. Russia loses 95,000 soldiers every month, 1.14 million soldiers per year. That's more than Russia's entire active duty military force. The mathematics of this casualty rate are simply incompatible with sustaining military operations for any extended period. Here's the fifth hook. Russia cannot replace losses at this rate. Russian military recruitment in 2024 has averaged approximately 35,000 new soldiers per month through voluntary enlistment and conscription. Even if every single recruit goes to the Ukraine front, with no training time, no assignments to other duties, no retention of forces for homeland defense, Russia is losing soldiers 3 times faster than it's recruiting them. The gap is unbridgeable through current mobilization methods. Russia's army is mathematically shrinking, and at current casualty rates, it will cease to exist as an effective fighting force within a timeline that is measured in months, not years. Think about what this means for Russia's strategic position globally. Russia has always relied on the perception of military power as its primary lever of international influence. Nuclear weapons provide deterrence, but conventional military force provides the ability to actually project power, coerce neighbors, and enforce demands. If Russia's conventional military is being destroyed at Bakhmut, and the casualty figures suggest it is, then Russia's ability to threaten anyone except through nuclear weapons is evaporating. Georgia considers retaking South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Moldova looks at Transnistria and wonders if Russia could actually defend that garrison. Even Kazakhstan starts questioning whether Russian security guarantees have any meaning when Russia can't even capture a medium-sized Ukrainian city without suffering catastrophic losses. The resilience of Ukraine's military, its ability to inflict these casualties while maintaining defensive positions, stands in stark contrast to the brittleness of Russia's military system, which responds to tactical failures not by adapting but by doubling down on failed methods. Ukrainian forces at Bakhmut are using combined arms tactics developed through Western training, integrating artillery, drones, electronic warfare, and infantry in tactics. Coordinated operations. Russian forces are using massed infantry assaults that would be outdated if this were 1944. The tactical sophistication gap is so wide that it produces casualty ratios that seem impossible. Ukrainian commanders report inflicting 10 or 15 Russian casualties for every Ukrainian loss in some engagements around Bakhmut. And yet, despite these horrific losses, despite the mathematical impossibility of sustaining current casualty rates, despite the evidence visible to anyone with access to satellite imagery or intercepted communications, Russian state media continues promoting the narrative that everything is proceeding according to plan. On November 12th, the Russian Defense Ministry released a statement claiming that Russian forces are systematically liberating Bakhmut with minimal losses while inflicting significant casualties on Ukrainian nationalist formations. Minimal losses. 95,000 casualties. The hollowness of Russian propaganda has never been more complete. So where does this leave us tonight? And what does this moment mean for how we understand military power, command, failure, and the human cost of authoritarian systems that cannot adapt when reality diverges from planning? What we're witnessing is not merely Russia failing to capture one city. What we're seeing is the complete exposure of Russian military incompetence at a scale that transforms every assumption about Russian power. Think about that. For decades, Western military planners designed force structures and doctrines based on the assumption that Russia represented a pure military threat capable of sophisticated combined arms operations. Russia is losing 3,000 soldiers per day using tactics that military historians thought had been abandoned after the First World War. The entire edifice of Russian military prestige has been revealed as hollow propaganda supported by nothing, not training, not tactics, not command competence, not equipment quality, nothing. Russia began the battle for Bakhmut believing that persistence and willingness to accept casualties would eventually break Ukrainian resistance. 2 years later, Bakhmut remains contested. Russia has suffered casualties approaching total active duty military strength at the war's start, and Ukrainian forces continue inflicting losses that no army can sustain. The crumbling of Russian military power isn't theoretical or debatable, it's visible in real time through satellite imagery showing bodies across Bakhmut's approaches, audible in intercepted communications of Russian soldiers describing the horror. measurable in casualty statistics that exceed anything seen in modern warfare. 95,000 casualties in 30 days teaches us something crucial about the danger of authoritarian command structures that cannot acknowledge failure, that once committed to a course of action, these systems would rather destroy themselves completely than admit they were wrong, would rather sacrifice entire armies than accept responsibility for mistakes, would rather continue tactics that everyone knows don't work than face the psychological and political consequences of changing course. Russian commanders keep ordering assaults that kill their soldiers not because they believe the assaults will succeed, but because stopping requires admitting that all the previous assaults that killed all the previous soldiers were pointless. The logic is insane. The consequences are catastrophic. The pattern is self-perpetuating. The Russian soldiers dying at Bakhmut deserve recognition as human beings caught in a nightmare created by their government's delusions and sustained by their commanders' inability to adapt. These are young men, many of them conscripts from Russia's poorest regions, sent to die in attacks that everyone from generals to privates understands cannot succeed. Their deaths serve no military purpose. They advance no strategic objective. They exist solely because admitting that their deaths are pointless would require Russian leadership to confront failures that leadership cannot psychologically accept. The 2,000 Russian trucks blocked at the Belarus border, the 12 Russian warships at the bottom of the Black Sea, the 95,000 Russian casualties in 30 days at Bakhmut. These aren't separate incidents. These are symptoms of the same underlying pathology, a system that responds to failure not by adapting but by doubling down, not by learning but by denying, not by changing course but by accelerating into catastrophe. So here's what we know tonight. Russia lost 95,000 soldiers in 30 days, fighting for a city of no strategic value. The casualty rate is unsustainable. The tactics are obsolete. The command structure that produces these results is completely dysfunctional. And nothing is changing. The assaults continue. The casualties mount. The crumbling accelerates. You can order soldiers into suicidal attacks. You can't make those attacks succeed through persistence alone. You can refuse to acknowledge casualties. You can't prevent those casualties from destroying your military capability. You can maintain propaganda narratives disconnected from reality. You can't prevent reality from eventually overwhelming propaganda when the gap between claims and facts becomes impossible to hide. History will remember Bakhmut as the place where Russian military power died, not through dramatic battlefield defeat, but through slow, grinding, self-inflicted destruction by commanders who preferred annihilation to adaptation. The city of 73,000 people became the graveyard of Russian military credibility. The ruins stand as monuments to what happens when authoritarian systems meet reality and choose delusion. The casualties accumulate as evidence that persistence without competence produces only catastrophe. I'm Rachel Maddow. Thank you for being here. Stay informed, and good night.